Nucleic acids are the last topic that we have on this chapter. And so we're going to start by looking at their general purpose, so what are they, and then we'll look at some of the ways we can investigate their structures. So nucleic acids make up everything. They basically are the recipe for you. And the one in particular I'm talking about is DNA. So you've heard a lot about DNA, and you know that DNA has information, and it's an information molecule that basically is the recipe book for all of the things which build an organism. So within any one of the cells of your body, you have a complete copy of DNA that could actually reproduce a whole nother you. But not all of that DNA is always being used by every cell all the time. So some of that DNA is basically, we want to think of it as a recipe book with lots of different pages for the different types of proteins that your body needs to manufacture for growth, for repair, or for any of the day-to-day activities that it needs to perform. RNA is something that is related to DNA, and that it will be something that can copy. It's actually making the copy of DNA, because DNA stays in the nucleus, but RNA has the ability to move out of the nucleus of a cell and into the areas which actually do make the proteins. So the two types of nucleic acids again are DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA, which is ribonucleic acid. So DNA codes for the genome of the cell. So the term genome, I wanted to just mention here, is related to all of the genes, really, that make any organism up. So when you hear the word genome, you want to sort of think of it as like the complete set of information that organisms have. Now, DNA is organized in various ways, and one of the ways that usually we can see it when it's sort of in its normal form, in the form of something called chromatin, which is, if you look over on this picture to the right, what you see is that it's kind of a long, skinny strand made up of, here's the double helix of DNA, so we're going to see that in a minute, but in the nucleus of a cell, in the center of a cell, it's wrapped around these proteins called histone proteins. And you can see then it supercoils, and it forms this thing called chromatin, which is a fiber. But then, when at certain points we can see the DNA as it's really very organized, we see that in the form of a chromosome, which you see up at the top. So these are tightly wound structures, and it's all about chromatin packed in. RNA is going to be involved with sending the message out, so making a copy of the DNA. So that's what messenger RNA is, or mRNA. So it's going to make a copy of some piece of that recipe book. In other words, it will copy information that we will call a gene, and then it leaves the nucleus. And then it's going to go out into areas within the outside of the nucleus called cytoplasm, which contain other types of DNA or RNA. One of them is going to be ribosomal RNA. So you can see this rRNA down here, which make up those things we're going to call ribosomes, and they make proteins. And then there's going to be transfer RNA, which is tRNA. And this is where we get back to our discussion on amino acids. So it's the amino acids that you eat and break down that are then used to construct new proteins, and that's what we'll see in more detail coming up. So just to give you a little bit of a picture representation of some of these structures. Some of you may have had a lot of this already in your middle school years, and some may not. So if this up here is representing an animal cell, which it is here, within the animal cell is in most animal cells, is a nucleus right here, and it's within the nucleus where we're going to find the DNA. So that's kind of the general idea. If it's a plant cell, it's going to look a little different because it'll have the plant cell walls are around those two. So there'd be a wall around the cell that would be made up of cellulose. The structures that make energy within a cell are called mitochondria, and these are, here's a picture of a mitochondrion here. We'll talk more about these two later on. But interestingly, mitochondria have their own DNA. So they have a different set of DNA than is restricted to this nucleus. And we'll talk about why. Chloroplasts do too. And they're also energy-producing structures, but they're found primarily in plants and in some types of smaller organisms we call protists. And then finally, at the very bottom, is a picture of something called a prokaryotic cell. So a prokaryotic cell doesn't have a nucleus. It has instead an area where the DNA is found, and that's called this nucleoid area. And just to give you an idea, so a prokaryotic cell would be something like a bacterial cell. So that's where we can find some of these nucleic acids. In the nucleus, in mitochondria, in chloroplasts, and in more just in general in the area of a bacterial cell or a prokaryotic cell that does not have a nucleus. Nucleic acids are informational macromolecules, and they are made up of several components, so we can look at these as polymers. There's going to be a base of some kind, and this base is something that's going to contain nitrogen. There's going to be a sugar, which is going to be one of two types, either ribose sugar or deoxyribose sugar. When those two things combine, when they form a bond between them, we call that a nucleoside. So it's kind of like the base is kind of stuck on the side of this one. But then there's one other piece, and that's the phosphate group. So remember phosphates, we've seen them a couple of times now. This is a functional group. And so when that phosphate group is a part of this, instead of calling it a nucleoside, now it has that real official name, the nucleotide. So a nucleotide is this unit that's going to build DNA and going to build, and actually RNA too, but we'll see that. So the ribose, here's a picture on the bottom here of ribose and deoxyribose sugars. You might recognize their shape. They look like the sugars that we've talked about already. And even the carbons here are numbered for you. So carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that tells you this is a pentose sugar, right? And so is deoxyribose. But look on to the right, and what you see is deoxyribose. The only difference here is that it's missing an oxygen, so it's been deoxygenated, kind of. So deoxyribose. And these are the sugars that are a part of those components of either DNA or RNA. If it's DNA, it has only deoxyribose. If it's RNA, it has ribose sugar. So when we start putting together those nucleotides, the RNA will only have a ribose sugar where deoxyribose is on DNA. Oh, sorry. And we'll look at these. So the bases can be one of two shapes too. They can either be a single ring or a double ring. And the single ring are called pyrimidines, and the double rings are called purines. So we'll see those very soon. So this little picture is not very good, I don't think, but I have another one on the slide set. So here are the different monomer units of these bases. So remember we said there are bases that are a part of this nucleotide. And the pyrimidines are the ones that just have a single ring. And here, this one here, cytosine and thymine. These two are going to be found exclusively in DNA. There's another one, though, that only shows up in RNA, and that's uracil. That's the U. And again, we'll talk about all of this again. It's just a preview, honestly. The purines, notice that they have this double ring structure. Double ring structure purines. And there are two of them, adenine and guanine. Now, these are nitrogen bases. So if you can see the slide well enough, you'll notice that there's nitrogen found in every single one of these. So it's not just carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. Now we have nitrogen in them. And that's often used, the term as nitrogenous bases is something you'll hear, nitrogenous bases, but either way. So you have a base, you have a pentose sugar, and you have one or more of the phosphate groups that we're about to see. Okay. This picture I liked, I added this one because I think it's a little clearer. So here you can see, here's the bases, these bases that are in DNA. Cytosine, with this, you can abbreviate as C. Thymine is T. And those are both pure pyrimidines. And then down here, the purines have the double rings. Adenine, which is A, and guanine, which is G. And then uracil up here, remember we said that this one we're only going to find in RNA. So we'll explain what this actually replaces one of the other bases in RNA. But all of these are making up those nucleotides. So you're going to have one of these bases. If it's DNA, you're going to have deoxyribose sugar. If it's RNA, ribose sugar. And all of them are going to have a phosphate. And that forms this unit, this monomer unit called a nucleotide.